We're going to be talking about maximising value from marine ecological survey design, and I'm joined by a number of my colleagues from APEM. Gillian, if you could just move on to the next slide for me, that would be great. Yeah, so just a brief introduction to APEM. For those of you who've not been on one of these sessions before, we are specialists in freshwater, marine and terrestrial ecology, and also in geospatial data, LiDAR, photogrammetry, and so on. Gillian, if you can move to the next slide. Yeah, so we work with private sector, government regulators, NGOs across the board, doing work in water, renewables, power and utilities, marine and ports. We work on construction projects and transport projects, and undertake a range of environmental assessments. Gillian, the next slide, please. So I'm joined this morning by 4 of my colleagues. So this is quite a broad topic that we're discussing this morning. So usually we've just had maybe 1 or 2, but this morning we have 4 of my colleagues. So as well as myself, Elliot Taylor, who's the Divisional Director for our office here in Ireland. We're primarily based here in Cork, where we have home workers in Galway and in Kerry. We're up to a staff of 8 now in APEM in Ireland, and you may know that we were joined by Woodrow Sustainable Solutions back in July. So that's another 20 staff added to our team of consultants here in Ireland, and up in Sligo. So we're also joined by my Divisional Director colleague, Gillian Sutherland. She heads the Marine Division. We also have Mark Hubble, who's an Associate Director for the Marine Consultancy. James Spencer, who's a Principal Ornithology Consultant. And Helen Hedworth, who's a Principal Marine Mammal Consultant. So they will take it in turns to present to you this morning. Gillian, the next slide, please. Yeah, so today's agenda, I will hand over now to Gillian to kick off the actual substantial part of the presentation. And thanks again for you all joining. Oh, I should say, please, we're happy to take questions. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you would be so kind as to pop your questions into the Q&A function, not the chat function, the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen if you move your cursor around. And then I'll go through those questions at the end, put them to my colleagues. Also, if you're feeling up to it, then you're perfectly welcome to come on air at the end when I start to take the question and answer session. So, but otherwise use the Q&A function. But with that, over to you, Gillian. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Elliot. Good morning and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us in this session. I'm based over in Glasgow at the moment, so we just saw the tail end of the storm, which is quite unusual, but yes, we survived, which is good. So yeah, today's session, we're really looking at maximising the value from marine ecological surveys. The overall aim of the presentation is to focus, to think about the objectives and focusing on kind of the role of collaboration and the design aspect itself to maximise the value. And we'll do that by looking at a number of focused examples. So I guess our hypothesis for the session today is about looking at what we can learn from the past. We want to share ideas, look at the methodology, look at examples, and look at how we can measure that through those case studies. And at the end, we'll basically look to review our learning and see, whether we've met that objective. So without further ado, I will move on to collaboration. So one of the key things I've learned in my experience, so I've been working in offshore wind for over 16 years and been with APEM for 18 months now, really focusing on the kind of the delivery of ecological design and working with a number of specialists, which is fantastic. But what really, I think becomes apparent is actually the roles of collaboration and actually the design elements to make sure that you actually get the outcome that you want from your ecological survey. So, one of the key things that I've learned through my experiences around collaboration is about recognising the roles and the interests of people and actually what the outcome is going to be. So thinking about you know, the overall objective, making sure that you're balancing, you know, the interests of each of those parties, thinking about, you know, the benefit of actually having agreement early on, without, you know, restricting potential for innovation as well. So, you know, engaging with stakeholders early on, what's the common goal? You know, if you want to get that acceptance of outcome, then the earlier you do that, the better. It also allows you, you know, to think about early on about any differences in scientific opinion from the outset. So that can be really influential in terms of how you actually set your hypothesis. And we need to also recognise that actually, while standardisation can be beneficial in particular circumstances, you do need to think about the design on individual merits. So that could be specific to a project, to an area, or to look at actually the receptors themselves in terms of what is needed for those. So it's really about actually, you know, working together. We've got a great example just of some collaborative groups here on the slide. OSMRF was something I was very proud to be involved in, established in 2019. That was a UK developer-led group, and it's managed by JNCC and continues to this date. It looks at identifying actually some of the knowledge gaps in the overall offshore wind industry and looking to fill those. So we started a pilot project and we focused just on ornithology. But I think that model really led to see that we could use that forum as a way of looking at those knowledge gaps across the industry. There's also a recognition that actually in terms of the power of data, working collaboratively can be really beneficial. A great example of this is actually a BWO study, which is a German collaboration of offshore operators from offshore wind, where they looked at a study on the impact of offshore pilot driving on harbour porpoises. So there was actually two periods of studies for that, one 2009 to 2013 and then 2014 to 2016. And essentially that was 10 developers who grouped together their data, looking at passive acoustic monitoring and porpoise detectors, and also digital aerial survey, to look at the impact and measured noise levels from the activity in that region over that period. So I think there was over 2,000 days of actually analysed data, and that is essentially enabled a regional assessment based on a number of kind of cumulative projects information. So that study was published, and you know, it was really useful to actually see how people can work collaboratively to get the results and, you know, really improve the value of those individual data sets. It's also really important to kind of recognise that there is a differentiation between kind of research-focused studies and impact-focused studies. So they can be complementary, but quite often developers find themselves torn between the two, where you've got project-specific monitoring plans to deliver, and actually some just wider, you know, gaps in knowledge around kind of marine receptors. So that's where really some of the other collaborative groups, such as ORGIP, really come into play, where they've got a delivery mechanism where we can pull together, you know, ideas and needs for that research, but actually doesn't necessarily impact on a project's consenting or permitting regime as well. Another great example of the research programme is the ScotMare programme that's led by Marine Scotland, and that's really looking at that holistic view, identifying that there are gaps in there that actually, you know, from a project perspective, not every offshore wind developer can actually realise that on their own. They need to work together, but also then to identify and actually look at longer term spatial and also the temporal side of things as well. So depending on the need, depending on the evidence, the actual gap itself depends on what, you know, that influences the design and also the delivery of that programme. The other key thing is recognising the role of innovation. You know, when you have got standardisation that's appropriate for particular circumstances, but also need to recognise that, you know, as our knowledge improves and we have more understanding of where some of the risks are, actually sometimes you need to adapt the technology. So we've seen that in terms of, you know, particularly digital aerial surveys for ornithology, marine mammals have moved away from ship-based surveys, but also recognising that actually there's other external challenges that come into play. So, you know, we did see during the kind of COVID restrictions as well that actually it was very difficult to deploy some ways of capturing information. So ship-based surveys, for example, it was very tricky to do, but we were able to continue to go out and capture aerial-based surveys. So Really recognising then the need for evolution. So it is about that continual loop, feeding the knowledge back in, looking at those improvements and looking at the technology and trying to be open to the idea that sometimes, you know, as any good science project, you need to try it and, you know, recognise that there may be failures within there, but actually, you know, overall, the lessons learned from that will benefit the wider good. Some other examples just on the slide there in terms of the deep ones, which was a collaboration of developers and scientific experts looking at the effect of disturbance on harbour porpoise in the North Sea. But really, you know, this is just really summarising, you know, if you focus on what it is you're actually trying to get, it is really about trying to get that agreement on the common goal without stifling that opportunity for innovation. So obviously, if you're trying to define the what, you need to really understand what your aim is, and then think about actually what the hypothesis is and what the trigger levels are, and that really influences your sampling strategy as well. So, you know, the overall purpose can really influence that design. Is it an EIA characterisation study, or is it actually looking at EIA impact monitoring? You know, we don't just want to be monitoring for monitoring's sake. We want to actually be getting the most out of actually what we can with the resources that we've got available. So really thinking about that in terms of appropriate sampling units. Is that specific to a receptor? Is it specific to a region? How can we generate, you know, a statistically robust sample size? You know, that's where the role of power analysis comes into play. But there's also, again, that point where the collaboration can play a role. So as we saw in the German example, you know, actually quite often when you're trying to answer a bigger question, if it's looking at kind of regional population impacts, then you need a much larger study area, you need a much larger study size, and that often cannot be appropriate to align to projects and permitting regimes. That maybe then lead towards kind of the research angle, or it could well be that actually, you know, then you just take a part of that question, focus on that and realise that actually you can answer that part and somebody else could answer the other. So that's where these collaborative programmes and the research works can really complement one another. It's important to think about the timing as well, the timing, the frequency, the duration of what you can do and what you need to do. Also to think about that from the environmental context, so looking at the impact of variables and parameters. So, you know, whether that is, again, it could be site specific, but it could be actually time of year as well. So thinking about actually then the value of the data and wider data programmes, it's then thinking about, well, what's your overall goal? Is there actually, and thinking early on, is there any additional value that you can actually get from this in terms of data programmes, so the wider context? Is there a national data set that what you're trying to work towards can then complement as well, can work towards? Is there standards in terms of the data that needs to be collected to be used in that? So the earlier you can think about this, the better, and set that out. And, you know, in terms of, particularly from a developer's view, if you're looking at contracting something and know what these are, then it makes it easier along the route. Also to think about actually what can be made publicly accessible. So, you know, some of these programmes that we've got listed here are where they're trying to promote the idea of, you know, data for all, access to data. And also, as we also think about kind of digital impact assessment as well, like actually how can we get the data on a platform that's usable and accessible and it can be used for wider purposes. So all those things, you know, early understanding of the final use of the data can really help, you know, you realise that value within there. But over these key principles that I've covered in the kind of introductory slides are really applicable to any of the ecological receptors that we're going to talk about. And we will now look at some specific examples, and I'm going to be starting with Mark, who's going to look at design for benthic surveys. So I'll pass on to you now, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Gillian. Today I'm going to be talking about a case study, which is some guidance documents that we developed with Natural Resources Wales for Benthic Ecology survey and monitoring design. So it's identified that there was a lot of guidance available, but it was spread across many different documents, many different sources, and not really easy to necessarily bring together. So the idea of this guidance was to collate as much information as we could specific to these habitats are indicated here, to make it a really useful and easy to use resource document for developers and consultants alike. So firstly, there's an overarching principles document, which indicates the main thoughts and considerations associated with survey and monitoring design. And then we've got these specific documents for each of these habitats. So APEM was involved in each of these, apart from the one for Sabulary Reef and seagrass beds. And within each of these, there's firstly an overview of the habitat type and associated subhabitats and information such as relevant UNIS codes. There's an indication of distribution around the coast of Wales, and that includes a map showing where these habitats are, so developers can see where their project is in relation to these habitat types. There's a section on conservation importance, so that identifies specific legislation and also why particular habitats and associated species are important under that legislation. And that covers European legislation such as the Habitats Directive, Birds Directive, Water Framework Directive and OSPAR, and also national considerations such as the Wildlife and Countryside Act and the Environment Wales Act Section 7 list, for example. Then there's sections on sensitivity, so it's indicating sensitivities of these different habitats and subhabitats to a range of anthropogenic pressures. Then there's a section on the existing guidance, so it means you can go and see the available guidance as well if you want further information. There's text on the specific survey and monitoring design requirements for each of these habitat types, and that refers back to the overarching principles document as well. Timing indications, when should these surveys be undertaken, and that refers to guidance including the Water Framework Directive guidance and Common Standards monitoring recommendations. And then section on best practice methods that are available for survey and the types of analysis that can be conducted. And that covers like geophysical survey, grab sampling, for example, and underwater video. These guides are all available online, and the best way to find them is to search for NRW Benthic Habitat Assessment Guidance, and it should be the first thing that comes up. Next slide, please, Gillian, thanks. So one of the key themes that runs through each of these guidance documents is a differentiation between survey for habitat characterization and for monitoring. And Gillian's touched on some of these points in the previous slides. For habitat characterization, generally that's to inform assessment. So it's gathering information for an area. So you need to have an understanding of the potential zone of influence of your project. Are there near field effects, far field effects? And you'd ideally have stations covering the whole of the ZOI as far as possible. And then you'd be looking at the availability of what existing data are there for that particular area. So where there's very little or none, you could be then requiring undertaking a grid design for your survey where you're covering a wide, a broad area that's to be covered. And if you've got information relating to, for example, the extent of different habitats and their distribution, then you can apply a more stratified approach to make sure that your sampling is really covering the range of habitat types that are present. With these types of surveys, you're gathering information in relation to the broad range of habitats and species present, and specific information such as density, community diversity data, for example. But of key importance and key consideration is, are there habitats or species of conservation importance? Are there any non-native species present? And also you can use the information to look at sensitivity of different species and habitats to different pressures. And this can be undertaken using the Marine Evidence Sensitivity Assessment Approach summaries, which are hosted on the Marlin website and are a really useful resource. So you need to determine which ecological parameters you're going to be looking at. So is it species abundance, density, habitat extent or habitat distribution, and then think about the methods that you'll be applying, where the sites will be located, so the plan for your design, and how many replicates you need to take. For site characterization, especially if the habitat's particularly homogeneous, it might be that you can just have single samples taken at a wider range of sites as opposed to replicates, but that's very much project specific and needs to be considered on a particular project basis. Then for monitoring, that's normally specifically to answer a given question or set of questions. So it's designed around a purpose, and it's often related to discharge of consent conditions. And there's different types of monitoring. One type of monitoring is pre and post construction, for example, to see what effects your development might be having. And that can often be targeted to specific habitats or species of conservation importance, or it could be a species that's known to be sensitive to the type of pressure that your development or project might be causing. Then you need to consider the type of parameters that you're going to be monitoring. Again, could be species density, community diversity, or habitat extent or distribution. And monitoring is often or nearly always based around a hypothesis. So that could be, there will be a change in this parameter for this given species, or there won't be a change in that parameter of the species. And then there's can be trigger levels. So when you do detect a certain level of change, that can then trigger additional actions or even additional monitoring as well. With monitoring, you need to give more consideration to control stations. You can have control stations for site habitat characterization, especially if it's going to feed into a later monitoring design. But usually your monitoring design is post the submission of the assessment, and it's for a specific purpose. So with your control stations, you're looking at potential effects outside your zone of influence. So you can consider natural variation in parameters over time, and you can use that information and compare it to what's happening within your zone of influence to see where the real changes are occurring. And then for monitoring, you really need to be thinking about how robust your strategy is and your approach. So thinking about sampling efforts, the number of replicates you've got, and you can use tools such as power analysis to help inform this. And then the frequency of sampling. So if it's post-construction sampling, how many years post-construction do you need to cover? So the main consideration with all of this is it's very project specific. And in the UK, often it involves consultation with the regulators, where you get them on board and you can discuss approaches to make sure that the most appropriate method is taken forward. So I'll now pass you on to James, who's going to cover some aspects related to ornithology.
Hi everybody, my name is James Spencer and I'm a principal within the Ornithology consultancy team. I work alongside the Marine Wildlife Surveys team who manage and deliver the aerial digital surveys for us. Now, aerial digital surveying uses cameras fixed to aircraft to collect images of the project area to identify marine wildlife, primarily birds and cetaceans. Firstly, I want to touch on the evolution of offshore bird and marine mammal surveys and the reasons behind this. These were originally undertaken by boat using transect methods and aerial visual surveys by low-flying aircraft. The reasons the industry has moved away from these to aerial digital are operational benefits, biological benefits, and statistical benefits. The operational benefits include health and safety. We fly at a higher survey altitude than aerial visual surveys, which is intrinsically safer. We're fast to mobilize with fewer weather constraints, and survey design is consistent and surveys can be repeated. Surveys can also be conducted in short timescales. Biological benefits, due to the increased flight height, there is a much reduced impact on the biota we're recording. And statistical benefits, there's no attraction or repulsion from the platform. We're able to undertake randomized designs. We now routinely use a grid-based approach, which is more closely allied to classic quadrats with more replicates than the original transect approach. And there's less temporal variation in data with a quantifiable sample area. And this all adds up to a more robust statistical approach. And this allows us to have confidence. There is a fully auditable permanent record, and this record is fully objective, and we reduce the potential for human error. This is underpinned by an evolution of data quality standards. APEM now routinely collect imagery of 1.5 centimeters ground sampling distance, rather than 3 centimeters or 2 centimeters, which were previously more commonplace. Such elevated standards have led to improvements in species identification of smaller sized seabird groups such as terns, auks and petrels. And we undertake power analysis, commonly used to determine the number of surveys and/or sites and the spatial coverage needed to ensure that population estimates of target species are of a desired precision. And this is underpinned by an evolution in technology. Understanding the importance of accurate flight height is essential, and APEM has developed complementary LiDAR equipment flown with standard surveys to provide precise locations of birds for use in collision risk modelling, and this reduces the need for precaution. Survey design is done on a case-by-case basis, understanding the particular needs of a project and considering site or species-specific issues. The purpose of these developments are to improve our ability to undertake site characterization or specialist monitoring surveys such as avoidance studies, and these are underpinned by robust design and power analysis. So moving on to my case studies on slide 2, I have 3 examples, 2 looking at design and 1 looking at analysis of data. The first, on the left-hand side, was a large-scale abundance and distribution digital aerial survey off the west coast of Ireland, and this was commissioned by the Marine Institute in the summer of 2020. The surveys were to investigate the distribution of seabirds off the west coast of Ireland from the Blasket in the south to Erris Head in the north in June and July, which is part of the breeding season. The main objective of the work was to look at the distribution and abundance of seabirds and marine megafauna within the defined target area. We undertook 95 transects spaced 2.5 kilometres apart, and this totalled over 1,600 kilometres of transect lines, and the data was collected at between 1.5 and 2 centimetre resolution as digital still images. This outlines our capacity to undertake very large and detailed studies within Ireland. The second example on the right-hand side is at the Greater Gabbard Wind Farm in the southern North Sea. So the hypothesis was that gannet densities would be lowest adjacent to the offshore wind farm and rising rapidly to reach a background at-sea density. The project was designed for statistical robustness, and for the sample size, it was aimed to record a minimum of 200 birds over 4 days. This would allow for differences in behaviour with weather and would allow confidence in the results. We quasi-randomly selected transects in order to obtain 200 records. And in actual fact, over 300 individual gannets were recorded around the offshore wind farm. Only 8 of the 336 gannets recorded were within the array, and the hypothesis was thus proved correct. Macro avoidance was estimated to be 95.6%, and allowing for micro avoidance, a 99.88% total avoidance was estimated. As a result of this study, SNCBs agreed to increase the avoidance rate from the 98% default value, as there were 10 times fewer predicted collisions. Moving on to my final slide, my third slide. The third case study is based on a site-based data analysis, and this was undertaken for Hornsea 4 offshore wind farm in the southern North Sea, refining the developable area site based upon a wider spatial data set. Looking at the central image, we have the auk data presented as hotspots. This was modelled with QGIS and MRC. Auks are guillemots and razorbills, and they seem to avoid the central part of the site and have their highest concentrations to the northwest and south, as well as a lesser concentration in the east. An initial amendment to remove the southern part of the site, as can be seen on the left-hand side, was followed by iterative designs removing the northeast and northwest respectively. And as can be seen, the array area has much lesser densities of birds, reducing the potential for displacement and disturbance. We followed the same process for flying birds, and they were concentrated in the same areas. We also ran collision risk modelling for 3 species, gannet, kittiwake, and great blackback gull, as these were shown to be the most at risk from the data set. We ran a number of scenarios with differing turbine sizes, spacings, and air gaps to find the most effective approach. Moving the air gap to 40 meters, which is currently the highest in the world, although I'm sure that title will be lost before too long. This eliminated the majority of potential collisions, making the wind farm far safer for these sensitive species. And this highlights how proactive involvement within a project helped to produce effective design and engineering solutions for the client. Now, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Helen Hedworth, who will be discussing marine mammals.
Thanks, James. Okay, great. So James has given us a nice introduction to digital aerial survey, and I'm just going to talk to you about marine mammals. So we have a few other types of visual survey methods as well as digital aerial. We've got boat-based, we've got land-based, and we can use marine mammal observers for each of these approaches. Now, clearly sea watching from land will only be possible for coastal projects, and both of these approaches will depend on a clear line of sight. So that can be affected by weather conditions and sea state. So as well as the visual surveys, we can use acoustic surveys. So benefits of passive acoustic monitoring. Well, of course, when we talk about marine mammals, we've got the seals, they spend a proportion of their time on land. And then we have whales, dolphins, and porpoises, which live exclusively in the water. And as diving mammals, we need to be in the right place at the right time to see them surface. So PAM gives us another tool for monitoring them. And if we consider that light doesn't penetrate very far beyond the sea surface and that chemical signals travel relatively slowly, sound's actually a very effective sensory modality for marine mammals. Particularly the cetaceans, they've developed a range of sounds to fit their multiple needs. They produce clicks, whistles, pulses, groans, and moans, and they use these in communicating with other animals, as well as for hunting and navigating through their environment. So PAM's effectively a tool for eavesdropping on these interactions and activities. There are some limitations of PAM. So for example, if an animal is present, but they're actually quiet, we won't know they're there through using PAM because the hydrophone won't detect any pressure changes. So we can say that PAM can be used to confirm presence, but not absence. And then the nature of the calls need to be considered when designing your survey. So for example, high frequency calls won't propagate as far as low frequency calls because the energy will be lost more quickly. And the high frequencies can also be highly directional, which makes them really effective for echolocation, but might mean that they're not picked up by your instrument. Some calls that are produced by marine mammals are very loud and travel across large parts of the globe, but others are so quiet that they can only be detected by a hydrophone in surface contact with the animal. So there are some things we've only recently discovered in terms of their calls. And finally, on a practical note, if you're using a static autonomous recorder, which is one that needs a set of batteries in order to operate and gets put in the water for a period of time, you're going to be limited as to how much time it can be deployed before it needs a service, because it will either run out of battery or it will run out of data storage capacity. One or the other will be first, most likely, and then it will need a service. So there are some things that we can do in terms of programming to elongate this period, but it's worth considering. And this isn't the same for your towed or your cabled devices, of course. So it may therefore be that the best approach combines visual and acoustic survey to produce the most robust assessment. So how do we go about using PAM effectively for survey? You might have some questions in mind, such as how many units should you use, which technologies should you use, towed, static, real-time, how should they be programmed, thinking about your frequency range, do you need a duty cycle to make the batteries and storage last longer, how should they be moored or are they going to be towed, how long should you leave them in the water, and how frequently do they need to be serviced? So in order to answer these practical questions, it's a good idea to start by thinking about what the goals are for the study. So what are your target species? Are you going to be particularly keen to look out for the high frequency cetaceans such as harbour porpoise, the mid frequency such as your dolphins and most toothed whales, or are you interested in the baleen whales which produce low frequency calls? Are you interested in the ambient sounds, the sounds of the environment? Are you thinking about other natural sounds that might be worth collecting, or indeed, are you interested in also recording anthropogenic sounds? So This will affect how we arrange the instruments and also how we program them. You've also got to ask what it is you're investigating. Are you interested in whether animals are present? Are you interested in activity, perhaps at certain times of day, certain times of year? Or is behavior important to you? So are you perhaps interested in whether animals move away from your study area and back to your study area surrounding, in the time surrounding a sound event, such as pile driving or shipping noise? Also, what are the consenting requirements? So you would need to consult the regulator and some other relevant stakeholders in order to open this discussion and really find out what's going to be important in the design. How accessible is the site? It might be that your site is a coastal site, in which case it's really easy to get to it. You'll have opportunities to use cabling that might negate the need for batteries in your units, but it might be a 6-hour steam offshore or even further away. So, you know, what are the sea conditions likely to be once you get there? How changeable is the site? What other hazards or constraints will there be at the site? Are there shipping lanes nearby? What other sea users are there? Do you need to think about unexploded ordnance or marine archaeological areas? What's the sea depth? What does the seabed look like? And how are you going to moor your instruments? And finally, what's your budget? Because while we might be wanting to get the best, highest resolution data possible and put down multiple units, of course, the more units, the more time you spend in the field, the more expensive this gets. So really, it's about making sure you consider redundancy of units. We might find that instruments fail or they might be lost. So it's about making best use of what you have with effective programming and putting the units in the right place to start with. So there's just a few thoughts about survey design. I'll just hand over to Gillian now.
Okay, yeah, so thanks, Helen. Really just to kind of conclude the session on marine mammals by looking at a specific case study that I was previously involved in and sharing some of those lessons learned from that. So again, the key theme running through here, collaboration. So it was really important when we were looking at designing a study for the East Anglia wind farm and for Scottish Power Renewables in the Southern North Sea. It was about actually, you know, this was actually a survey that was not required as part of the permit. It was an additional survey that Scottish Power Renewables took the initiative to take forward, and really, you know, commend them for doing that. It was really quite tricky to get it off the ground. There was a lot of collaboration in the early stages with stakeholders, talking to other developers, but looking at trying to work a study that would be getting us more information about, you know, particularly East Anglia One site, sorry, is in a designated area for harbour porpoise. That was a new designation that came in partly through the permitting process. So yes, it was really recognising that the piling events of the offshore wind farm would potentially have an effect on the harbour porpoise, and how could we look to kind of gather some information during the piling activity to better understand what the impacts would be. So, yep, so we spent a lot of time working on trying to actually get agreement in terms of the scope, thinking about what we could actually do. And one of the key things actually was about the timing side of it as well. So trying to make sure and understanding what the actual construction programme was to make sure that we had enough time to actually get what we wanted to do in the water in time. We did think about it a bit kind of last minute. So it was really about then speaking to the stakeholders and getting agreement about actually, you know, okay, we originally wanted to do a period of 6 months prior to construction, but we ended up only having just under 3 months of that. But, you know, the question was, should we continue to do this? Is there still going to be value within the survey? And of course, the answer was yes. So it was really about thinking and defining, you know, what is the objective of what we're trying to do, and what we agreed at that point was about what are the population consequences for porpoise because as a result of East Anglia One piling. We had to consider about the kind of limitations as well in terms of some of the spatial and temporal aspects. we really had to think about the end goal, and say that then defined the sample size, which affects in terms of actually when you're procuring the devices, what you can get hold of in that short time scale. So actually having that iterative process as well is really important. Actually deciding where, from a design perspective, you can map it out. When you actually try and go and put it in the water, there can be a lot of other constraints that you're not aware of and logistics you need to think about. So we had to think about those as well, whether it be the actual seabed depth and sediment type at the time, trying to make sure that we minimised any potential kind of a variation from the influence of the seabed type on the kind of acoustic recorders and we replaced them. The fact that it was in a protected habitat as well, trying to protected sites, and try to avoid any other protected habitats that were there, thinking about fishing activity as well, existing infrastructure, and then also importantly traffic and construction activities that were happening in the same time. So I think in recognition that you might not get the best design, but there is a value in terms of that collaboration and trying to get the best that you can with the restrictions that you have. So don't overlook the end goal, and don't, just because there might be one thing that's compromised, it doesn't necessarily mean to say that you won't get value in that. So, take sight of that. So overall, we ended up deploying 12 C-pods and 6 noise recorders in and around the site, and those were deployed in 2018. So we did manage to gather some pre-construction survey data. And then ultimately, the actually recognition that whilst we were aiming to get information about the piling events, there was also other activities happening at the same time. So we did a UXO clearance as well. And again, that's where we've actually ended up with value in that data set for gathering some information, and we can use that potentially for looking at other objectives and hypotheses from that data set. So overall, I would just say that, there was a lot of planning involved. We had to think about the licensing, we had to think about the actual location, we tried to maximise what we could do in a short period of time, and also trying to maintain the equipment in an offshore environment was challenging. I'm actually working with different contractors as well. I would just say that early on, if you can think about, again, that end point of the data, so we were looking at doing some population modelling and trying to think about actually what information and trying to get all the different contractors involved and speaking to each other to understand how the interface of their part of the project would actually play to make it, say, the best value that we could get out of it. And Scottish Power Renewables have been presenting the results of that as well. So they were looking at noise propagation modelling and looking at use of population models such as DPODs and IP codes to actually look at the impact of that. So, overall, all our efforts, in that we managed to get survey data, we've managed to collect really useful data for the rest of the industry. We did work collaboratively with our stakeholders and think, there's benefits, but there's also a lot of lessons learned in terms of actually getting to that point as well. So a good example there. Okay, so that's really just a kind of conclusion of all the case studies, a bit of a taster in terms of different receptors as well. And overall, in terms of those recommendations, hopefully you've seen the key themes come through there as well. It is about actually, making sure that you scope out what you want to do, engage with others to do that, to make sure that you can get the best out of it. Think about your limitations, understand your limitations, and don't shy away from them, because inevitably those are the ones that people will ask questions for at the end. So think about them early on. If you need to park them, park them. Think about future proofing. So what kind of technology are you using? Can you use the best available at that time? Is it appropriate? Think about the changing environment as well. So keep on top of any potential licensing requirements that you might have for deploying equipment or for retrieving equipment as well. Think about the wider aspects in terms of what data you're collecting, if that can be useful for wider data sets. So such as the Marine Spatial Framework Directive, there's a lot of programmes and studies that are ongoing with that. Can you use that wider information to help you get the most value out of it? So it's really about planning, consult, think about that regular review. So the plan, do, check, act. That review process was really important, really from the early stages as well. So when you're starting to design those surveys as well, think about what the consequences might be, and look at all the options to make sure that everybody's bought in with what your final line of sight is going to be. And that will help you manage those expectations, you know, realise that actually, you know, sometimes we can't get answers to everything, but there are other ways of doing that, and actually sometimes just collecting a smaller data set can play a really important part in that wider aspect. And really just encourage people to promote the results with some great sessions from industry this week, with Scottish Power Renewables actually having their Ornithology conference as well, but actually talk about the results, you know, share those results, try and make them publicly available if you can. Because again, that's where people, you know, can learn those lessons from, you know, how it's been done, how we can make it better, and actually to get ultimately, you know, the maximum value of what we're trying to do. So hopefully you found that useful, and I will move back to Elliot, pass back to you for any questions.
Thanks very much, Gillian. It was a fascinating set of presentations for a freshwater ecologist like myself. I've certainly learned a lot in the last 50 minutes or so. Yeah, we've got 5 questions that have come in. So we'll take the first one. I think this was submitted when you were speaking, Mark. There's always a dilemma whereby you anticipate that you wish to use the habitat characterization survey as a first sampling event for monitoring. This may mean that you oversample initially to provide adequate statistical power. From your experience, is it preferable not to anticipate future monitoring and accept that monitoring is a completely separate program?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question, and yeah, I think the best approach is have your site characterization survey designed specifically for that purpose to gather the information that you need for assessment, and then your monitoring survey design should be informed by the findings of your assessment, so that you've got your specific questions that you need to be answering from the monitoring and your specific conditions of consent, for example. The reason that it's better to do it that way is, as you say, you could oversample at the site characterization stage by anticipating monitoring that's not needed. And also it's hard to design an effective and really robust monitoring program when you don't know what you're monitoring, which is what that situation would be. So site characterization first, and then designing a specific monitoring program afterwards is the ideal. There can be cost constraints and there can be benefits of thinking about monitoring at the site characterization stage, but that depends a lot on the situation.
Thanks, Mark. There's a couple of questions on fish as well. I know we don't have one of our fisheries experts on our panel, but I'll put it out there and see if any of you can answer. So there's this sort of two, I think there's essentially a similar question, but can you provide information on studies on the impacts on migratory species such as salmon and navigation impacts, and how can effects on migratory fish species of interest be adequately monitored? I don't know if any of you can answer that, or if we pass that on to one of our fisheries people to come back on.
Yeah, unfortunately, I did consider having a fish section on it, but I just thought it was just too tight for time to bring them in as well. So yeah, more than happy to take contact details and answer, and we can get some responses on that one, unless there's anything else you can cover, Elliot.
Yeah, those were both from an anonymous person, so I can't. But if whoever that is wants to send an email to the details for this webinar, then we can certainly look to provide an answer to that question.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the next one is, in your experience, have collaborative efforts managed to effectively address cumulative effects of several projects happening concurrently in adjacent locations? I don't know who wants to.
Yeah, so yeah, again, back to one of the examples that I shared on the Geisha study. So that was looking at gathering data on 10 offshore wind farm constructions in the German Bight. So yeah, that study essentially was to look at so every project in Germany has to undertake noise monitoring and mitigation as prescribed by the authorities there. And this was really looking at the wider regional issue to see whether there was any impact on harbour porpoise and cetaceans in that area. So essentially, the output of that study was that there was no evidence of population level impact from those activity. So I think that's where it is really important about understanding, you know, what your objective is in terms of if it's looking at a region or whether it's looking at a wider, you know, what your sample size is as well, and thinking about the impact. So one of the conclusions from then the SPR study as well, looking at there is, you know, whether the impact of East Anglia 1 piling would affect harbour porpoise, was that actually, you know, there's no evidence to suggest that that is the case. However, there was also recognised that actually, you know, it is important that they fit, that type of study fits into a bigger scheme as well. So that's only saying, you know, East Anglia 1 on its own doesn't have that. So, you know, ideally, if we had a number of data sets from different developers over a larger period of time, we would then be able to do that. And it actually, whilst the population models used do lend to project specific analysis, they also are more beneficial at the wider spatial stage as well. So it is important to have that collaboration and look at, you know, actually combining some of those data sets as well to try and get the best out of it.
Thanks, Gillian. There's a question on PAM systems for you, Helen. Is there any guidance report on what PAM system should be used depending on the study objectives?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and actually it's something that probably a lot of people have thought about, in that there aren't really any standards for PAM. So in terms of where you are, where your study is taking place, and exactly the objectives of your study, that will really be important in determining which PAM setup you use. So there are a few different options available in terms of instruments, such as from towed and static instruments, and then you might need to use real-time instruments. But no, there isn't really a guidance report on exactly the instrumentation to use. This year, actually, NOAA and BOEM brought out some minimum recommendations for the use of PAM in offshore wind. So that's obviously for the US, waters. However, they don't really stipulate exactly what instrumentation should be used. So again, it's something that really needs to be discussed on a project by project basis.
Great, thanks, Helen. There's a few questions that relate to the digital aerial survey, so maybe I can try and bundle those together. So what distance outside wind farm sites is the recommended minimum for digital aerial surveys? Are digital aerial surveys suitable for all cetacean species in Ireland, given the 2018 report on unsuitability of aerial for minke from Scottish Natural Heritage and a range of species present in Ireland?
Okay, I can hopefully try and cover two of those. So yeah, in terms of distance outside the wind farm site, so yeah, I mean, we typically refer to that as a buffer, and yeah, quite often during site characterisation, the buffer is on a wider development area anyway, and therefore can vary in terms of actually of the project area, as we've seen from James's presentation as well. Quite often the developable area will be defined from the wider data. So in terms of standards for buffer, it can really depend on the region that you're working in, and actually what the expectation is in terms of existing knowledge of likely receptors in that area as well. So whether you're looking at, you know, divers or whether it's other types of species as well. So yeah, typically we see it's between 4 and 10 kilometres, but that doesn't mean to say that actually for a specific targeted objective you would want to look at, you know, a wider study. So it depends whether you're looking at displacement specifically, or whether you're just looking at general characterisation as well. In terms of the use of digital aerial surveys for marine mammals, so yeah, so obviously we recognise that there is a limitation in terms of how much you can see within the water column. So it depends in terms of those species that, you know, but we can pick up all species if we can see them. If they're in the top 2 metres, we'll be able to pick them up from the surveys as well. But that's where, again, there is that benefit of doing complementary in-field surveys as well, where you're gathering information in terms of localisation in the PAMs.
Thanks, Gillian. There's another one that relates to the aerial survey versus boat-based. Is there still value with limited boat-based checks, especially for far offshore sites where knowledge may be limited? For example, assume an aerial survey will cover an area of sea much quicker than a boat survey and may miss fly-throughs passing cetaceans.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because we've certainly found, you know, the development of offshore wind farm and the fact that it is going further offshore now, that actually digital aerial surveys and using aircraft is much more preferred in terms of, you know, you can get out quicker in terms of the mobilisation, and you can cover a larger area in a shorter period of time as well. So, yes, so there is, you know, I mean, we would certainly say that, you know, from a digital aerial perspective, you can capture more in a period by using the digital aerial side of things. In terms of boats, so we have seen, you know, particularly in other European countries where there's use of radar, for example, that's carried out on the boats. But certainly from our experience in terms of trying to look at characterisation studies, the fact that you do have the potential attraction of birds to boats is one of the areas that actually we've seen a move away to, you know, flying at suitable flight heights that doesn't disturb the birds.
Great, thanks. And then does APEM gather data on marine birds and other bird groups that may be passing through or over a development site on passage? And related to that, if the data is collected, is it sufficient in terms of targeting and quantity to adequately characterise the development area for these passage birds?
James, I don't know if you maybe want to come in that, but certainly the micropath aspect.
So certainly we do collect the data for passage birds. So examples include geese and other things, swans that pass through in sort of concentrated numbers at certain times of year. We use a tool called MigraPath, as Gillian's alluded to, and my colleagues within the Marine Wildlife Surveys apply this in their work. Gillian, I don't know if you want to just elucidate on the MigraPath tool a little bit.
Yeah, so this has been developed over the last kind of 10 years as well, but it's essentially a way to use statistical analysis to say about, you know, in terms of what we see, in terms of species that we do find in the wider context as well. So it can be really useful, again, at that kind of data characterizations, baseline characterization stage, to understand kind of what's there and, you know, how long you're seeing it for, but what that actually means more statistically.
Okay, great. A couple questions left here. So what period of monitoring periods prior to construction in Ireland? That's not very clear to me, I'm afraid.
So yeah, I guess the pre-construction monitoring depends on the specific receptor that you're looking at as well. Often, and I don't know specifically in Ireland, however, typically we would see at any time between kind of 12 months for kind of, you would normally do a 1 year pre-construction survey if it was regards to ornithology and marine mammals, and in terms, one of the key things that you have to be aware of is actually the validity of your data in terms of when you're doing that. So for example, for benthic surveys, we typically would see an advisor saying, you know, it needs to be at least within the 6 month, you know, 6 months before you actually start your works as well. So yeah, I'm not sure entirely yet what the Irish market's going to require, but again, that really depends on what the objective is that you're trying to do. But you know, if you've got baseline characterization and then you've got a shorter duration, so a lot of it really depends on how long this permitting process takes, which we have kind of limited knowledge and experience of. But you know, in a typical DCO project, you can be over 5 years from actually completing, you know, your environmental statement to actually getting something in the ground. So it's just about making sure you've got valid data for, you know, fit for purpose for actually doing, if you're doing a before and after control impact assessment, that you've got the right amount of data to enable you to do that. Right. So still to be determined.
Thanks, Gillian. Well, we're nearly 11:05, but there's a couple of questions left. So, and we've still got a good number of people with us. So let's just try and get through those. If you have a heterogeneous environment, what would be the recommended number of replicate samples to collect during habitat characterization surveys?
So the benefits of taking replicates during site characterization is we obviously use a grab data to allocate biotopes to different areas. So if you've got 3 replicates for a particular spot in a heterogeneous habitat, you get an idea if they need to be allocated to different biotopes. So it helps with the fine scale aspect of habitat allocation. You're obviously sampling a greater volume of sediment, so you've got more chance of finding maybe non-native species or other species of conservation interest. So you basically get more information from the replicates when you've got the single sample. Yeah, but basically it's reduced. So where it is homogeneous, you can get away with that. And the cost considerations can come into it for survey design as well. So generally, I think the preference is still to take replicates, certainly where the habitat is heterogeneous, to get that extra information. And that depends on, yeah, the habitat in particular.
Thanks, Mark. And the last question is quite a long one. I think this one is for you, Helen. The use of MMO and PAM operators was mentioned for recruitment use on marine mammal surveys. MMOs are not surveyors in this sense, as the MMO is mitigation monitoring role typically, and generally many MMOs lack experience with implementing survey methodology. What kind of quality control can you implement as a consultancy to ensure correct recruitment for these roles? They go on to say, also the same can be said with PAM operators, where a lack of experience in consultants is evident when they are hired and the setup of systems can be questioned. There are very experienced and competent MMO and PAM operators in the industry, but sadly, many are not experienced or suited for scientific surveys.
Yeah, no, really, really good comment, and sort of a comment and a question in one, really. And yeah, I suppose there's first of all a differentiation, I suppose, that you're saying with this comment, in that, you know, we've been talking about surveys, but actually MMOs and PAM operators will often be used for the mitigation part of a project. So I suppose I was probably using the term survey a bit more loosely and widely to cover off all the different stages at which you might need to carry out marine mammal observations or to use PAM. Excuse me. So yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. How do you ensure quality control? I completely agree. I think that there are lots of very competent MMOs and PAM operators out there and working on different projects. So it's about sort of working out who has the relevant experience for the project, which can be difficult. There was a question before about PAM in terms of systems and standardizations, and I was saying that there aren't really any standards for PAM instrumentation. And equally, we see that while we do have a few different courses around the world that train MMOs up, they might be called something different in different countries, to a certain standard, there isn't really the same opportunity for PAM training. And that's something that is definitely being discussed at the moment. Actually, one of my colleagues has been involved in some of these discussions about standardizing PAM. New Zealand does have standards for PAM training, but they're really the only country that I'm aware of that does that. So yeah, I completely agree that we do need to make sure that we're finding the right people for the job, and it is important to understand what experience your consultants have had when you engage them in the work. So hopefully that has sort of agreed with you and kind of given you some sort of response to that really sensible comment.
Great, thanks very much, Helen. I think we're going to have to draw it to a close there. We're nearly 11:10. Sorry for the unanswered questions. I have got a list of them here. Maybe we can try and respond via email to those. I think they both had names attached to them. So thanks again for fantastic attendance this morning. I hope it's been of interest and help to you. Just to alert you that our next webinar, we will carry on this series of technical webinars into 2022, is on how much water does a river need? Does statistics have the answer? And that will be given by my colleague, Dr. Andrew Davey.